Meditations on First Philosophy, René Descartes, 1641. Meditation 5, of the essence of material things, and again of God, that He exists. Many other matters respecting the attributes of God and my own nature or mind remain for consideration. But I shall possibly, on another occasion, resume the investigation of these. Now, after first noting what must be done or avoided in order to arrive at a knowledge of the truth, my principal task is to endeavor to emerge from the state of doubt into which I have these last days fallen, and to see whether nothing certain can be known regarding material things. But before examining whether any such objects as I conceive exist outside of me, I must consider the ideas of them insofar as they are in my thought, and see which of them are distinct and which confused. In the first place, I am able distinctly to imagine that quantity which philosophers commonly call continuous, or the extension in length, breadth, or depth, that is, in this quantity, or rather in the object to which it is attributed. Further, I can number in it many different parts, and attribute to each of its parts many sorts of size, figure, situation, and local movement, and finally, I can assign to each of these movements all degrees of duration. And not only do I know these things with distinctness when I consider them in general, but likewise, however little I apply my attention to the matter, I discover an infinitude of particulars respecting numbers, figures, movements, and other such things, whose truth is so manifest and so well accords with my nature, that when I begin to discover them, it seems to me that I learn nothing new, or recollect what I formerly knew. That is to say, that I for the first time perceive things which were already present to my mind, although I had not as yet applied my mind to them. And what I here find to be most important is that I discover in myself an infinitude of ideas of certain things which cannot be esteemed as pure negations, although they may possibly have no existence outside of my thought, and which are not framed by me, although it is within my power either to think or not to think them, but which possess natures which are true and immutable. For example, when I imagine a triangle, although there may nowhere in the world be such a figure outside my thoughts, or ever have been, there is nevertheless in this figure a certain determinate nature, form, or essence, which is immutable and eternal, which I have not invented, and which in no wise depends on my mind, as appears from the fact that diverse proportions of the triangle can be demonstrated, viz., that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, that the greatest side is subtended by the greatest angle, and the like, which now, whether I wish it or do not wish it, I recognize very clearly as pertaining to it, although I never thought of the matter at all when I imagined a triangle for the first time, and which therefore cannot be said to have been invented by me. Nor does the objection hold good that possibly this idea of a triangle has reached my mind through the medium of my senses, since I have sometimes seen bodies triangular in shape, because I can form in my mind an infinitude of other figures regarding which we cannot have the least conception of ever having been objects of sense, and I can nevertheless demonstrate various properties pertaining to their nature, as well as to that of the triangle, and these must certainly all be true, since I conceive them clearly. Hence they are something, and not pure negation. For it is perfectly clear that all that is true is something, and I have already fully demonstrated that all that I know clearly is true. And even although I had not demonstrated this, the nature of my mind is such that I could not prevent myself from holding them to be true so long as I conceive them clearly. And I recollect that even when I was still strongly attached to the objects of sense, I counted as the most certain those truths which I conceived clearly as regards figures, numbers, and the other matters which pertain to arithmetic and geometry, and in general to pure and abstract mathematics. But now, if just because I can draw the idea of something from my thought, it follows that all which I know clearly and distinctly as pertaining to this object does really belong to it, may I not derive from this an argument demonstrating the existence of God? It is certain that I no less find the idea of God, that is to say, the idea of a supremely perfect being, in me, than that of any figure or number, whatever it is. And I do not know any less clearly and distinctly that an eternal existence pertains to this nature than I know that all that which I am able to demonstrate of some figure or number truly pertains to the nature of this figure or number. And therefore, although all that I concluded in the preceding meditations were found to be false, the existence of God would pass with me as at least as certain as I have ever held the truths of mathematics to be. This indeed is not at first manifest, since it would seem to present some appearance of being a sophism. For being accustomed in all other things to make a distinction between existence and essence, I easily persuade myself that the existence can be separated from the essence of God, and that we can thus conceive God as not actually existing. But nevertheless, when I think of it with more attention, I clearly see that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than can its having its three angles equal to two right angles be separated from the essence of a triangle, or the idea of a mountain from the idea of a valley. And so there is not any less repugnance to our conceiving a God to whom existence is lacking than to conceive of a mountain which has no valley. But although I cannot really conceive of a God without existence any more than a mountain without a valley, still, from the fact that I conceive of a mountain with a valley, it does not follow that there is such a mountain in the world. Similarly, although I conceive of God as possessing existence, it would seem that it does not follow that there is a God which exists. For my thought does not impose any necessity upon things. And just as I may imagine a winged horse, although no horse with wings exists, so I could perhaps attribute existence to God, although no God existed. But a sophism is concealed in this objection. For from the fact that I cannot conceive a mountain without a valley, it does not follow that there is any mountain or any valley in existence, but only that the mountain and the valley, whether they exist or do not exist, cannot in any way be separated one from the other. While from the fact that I cannot conceive God without existence, it follows that existence is inseparable from him, and hence that he really exists. Not that my thought can bring this to pass, or impose any necessity on things, but on the contrary, because the necessity which lies in the thing itself, i.e., the necessity of the existence of God, determines me to think in this way. For it is not within my power to think of God without existence, that is, of a supremely perfect being devoid of a supreme perfection, though it is in my power to imagine a horse either with wings or without wings. And we must not here object that it is, in truth, necessary for me to assert that God exists after having presupposed that he possesses every sort of perfection, since existence is one of these, but that, as a matter of fact, my original supposition was not necessary, just as it is not necessary to consider that all quadrilateral figures can be inscribed in the circle. For supposing I thought this, I should be constrained to admit that the rhombus might be inscribed in the circle since it is a quadrilateral figure, which, however, is manifestly false. Although it is not necessary that I should at any time entertain the notion of God, nevertheless, whenever it happens that I think of a first and sovereign being, and, so to speak, derive the idea of him from the storehouse of my mind, it is necessary that I should attribute to him every sort of perfection, although I do not get so far as to enumerate them all, or to apply my mind to each one in particular. And this necessity suffices to make me conclude, after having recognized that existence is a perfection, that this first and sovereign being really exists, just as though it is not necessary for me ever to imagine any triangle, yet whenever I wish to consider a rectilinear figure composed only of three angles, it is absolutely essential that I should attribute to it all those properties which serve to bring about the conclusion that its three angles are not greater than two right angles, even although I may not then be considering this point in particular. But when I consider which figures are capable of being inscribed in the circle, it is in no wise necessary that I should think that all quadrilateral figures are of this number. On the contrary, I cannot even pretend that this is the case, so long as I do not desire to accept anything which I cannot conceive clearly and distinctly. And in consequence, there is a great difference between the false suppositions such as this and the true ideas born within me, the first and principal of which is that of God. For really I discern in many ways that this idea is not something factitious and depending solely on my thought, but that it is the image of a true and immutable nature. First of all, because I cannot conceive anything but God himself, to whose essence existence necessarily pertains. In the second place, because it is not possible for me to conceive two or more gods in this same position. And granted that there is one such God who now exists, I see clearly that it is necessary that he should have existed from all eternity, and that he must exist eternally. And finally, because I know an infinitude of other properties in God, none of which I can either diminish or change. For the rest, whatever proof or argument I avail myself of, we must always return to the point that it is only those things which we conceive clearly and distinctly that have the power of persuading me entirely. And although amongst the matters which I conceive of in this way, some indeed are manifestly obvious to all, while others only manifest themselves to those who consider them closely and examine them attentively. Still, after they have once been discovered, the latter are not esteemed as any less certain than the former. For example, in the case of every right-angled triangle, although it does not so manifestly appear that the square of the base is equal to the squares of the other two sides, as that this base is opposite to the greatest angle, still, when this has once been apprehended, we are just as certain of its truth as of the truth of the other. And as regards God, if my mind were not preoccupied with prejudices, and if my thought did not find itself on all hands diverted by the continual pressure of sensible things, there would be nothing which I could know more immediately and more easily than him. For is there anything more manifest than that there is a God? That is to say, a supreme being, to whose essence alone existence pertains. And although for a firm grasp of this truth, I have need of a strenuous application of mind, at present I not only feel myself to be as assured of it as of all that I hold as most certain, but I also remark that the certainty of all other things depends on it so absolutely that without this knowledge it is impossible ever to know anything perfectly. For although I am of such a nature that as long as I understand anything very clearly and distinctly, I am naturally impelled to believe it to be true, yet because I am also of such a nature that I cannot have my mind constantly fixed on the same object in order to perceive it clearly, as I often recollect having formed a past judgment without at the same time properly recollecting the reasons that led me to make it, it may happen meanwhile that other reasons present themselves to me which would easily cause me to change my opinion if I were ignorant of the facts of the existence of God, and thus I should have no true and certain knowledge, but only vague and vacillating opinions. Thus, for example, when I consider the nature of a triangle, I, who have some little knowledge of the principles of geometry, recognize quite clearly that the three angles are equal to two right angles, and it is not possible for me to not believe this so long as I apply my mind to its demonstration. But so soon as I abstain from attending to the proof, although I still recollect having clearly comprehended it, it may easily occur that I come to doubt its truth, if I am ignorant of there being a God. For I can persuade myself of having been so constituted by nature that I can easily deceive myself, even in those matters which I believe myself to apprehend with the greatest evidence and certainty, especially when I recollect that I have frequently judged matters to be true and certain, which other reasons have afterwards impelled me to judge to be altogether false. But after having recognized that there is a God, because at the same time I have also recognized that all things depend upon him, and that he is not a deceiver, and from that have inferred that what I perceive clearly and distinctly cannot fail to be true, although I no longer pay attention to the reasons for which I have judged this to be true, provided that I recollect having clearly and distinctly perceived it, no contrary reason can be brought forward which could ever cause me to doubt of its truth. And thus I have a true and certain knowledge of it. And this same knowledge extends likewise to all other things which I recollect having formerly demonstrated, such as the truths of geometry and the like. For what can be alleged against them to cause me to place them in doubt? Will it be said that my nature is such as to cause me to be frequently deceived? But I already know that I cannot be deceived in the judgment whose grounds I know clearly. Will it be said that I have formerly held many things to be true and certain, which I have afterwards recognized to be false? But I had not had any clear and distinct knowledge of these things, and not as yet knowing the rule whereby I assure myself of the truth, I had been impelled to give my assent from reasons which I have since recognized to be less strong than I had at the time imagined them to be. What further objection can then be raised? That possibly I am dreaming, an objection I myself made a little while ago, or that all the thoughts which I now have are no more true than the fantasies of my dreams. But even though I slept, the case would be the same, for all that is clearly present to my mind is absolutely true. And so I very clearly recognize that the certainty and truth of all knowledge depends alone on the knowledge of the true God, insomuch that before I knew him, I could not have a perfect knowledge of any other thing. And now that I know him, I have the means of acquiring a perfect knowledge of an infinitude of things, not only of those which relate to God himself and other intellectual matters, but also of those which pertain to corporeal nature, insofar as it is the object of pure mathematics.